Hello. There are a lot of people in here. This is great. I was out right in front with a big crowd of people really excited about web application security and very much wanting to come into this room, which I think is awesome, because usually web application security is not the most sexy of topics. So I'm really happy that there are this many of you that are really curious about this, and I hope I can help you out in some way. My name is Mike West. I work at Google on Chrome. I do some stuff in Chromium. I do some stuff in Blink. If you want to talk about any of that afterwards, I'd be happy to. You can reach me at any of these very interesting places. My blog, mikewest.org, I update it like twice a year. I'm pretty responsive on Google+ and Twitter, and if you want to drop me an email, you can find my email address pretty easily. The slides are up right now. If you want to hop onto the internet, if that is indeed possible, you can pull the slides down. They're on Speaker Deck. Speaker Deck is awesome. I highly recommend you take a look at it. So today I'm going to be talking about web application security. And specifically, I want to talk about web application security from the client side. There was an interesting talk earlier today that focused a lot on source code and focused a lot on what you can do in the server and in terms of your development practices in order to build secure applications. What I'd like to talk to you about today is not the server side of things, not the Java code, not the PHP code, not whatever it is you're doing on the back end, but instead what you can do in browsers, what you can do in the user agent in order to make your applications more secure. There are a variety of things that modern web applications or modern browsers will allow you to do, and I'd like to talk about a couple of them today. I think some of them are really quite important. Just as a quick show of hands, just so I know where to focus my attention, how many of you know what cross-site scripting is? OK, that's everybody. That's awesome. How many of you have had cross-site scripting bugs in your applications? How many of you don't know that you've had cross-site scripting bugs in your applications? OK, that's pretty much everybody, or it should be everybody, because generally speaking, everyone is going to have cross-site scripting holes. They're really, really difficult to get right. We'll talk about it a little bit just to make sure everybody's on the same page, but that's good. We seem to have a common basis. Just out of curiosity, how many of you just accidentally came into this room and you're not really interested in web security, you're just stuck here out of politeness now? Nobody. Excellent. Or at least no one wants to admit it. That's great. So, who knows what this picture is? Does anyone know? Has anyone seen this before? OK, one person. Culture, people. Come on. Art. It's really interesting. This is Odysseus and the Sirens. It's an interesting story from a really old book called the Odyssey. It goes something like this. The sirens sing beautifully. So beautifully, in fact, that they drive men to the brink of madness. Once you hear the song of the siren, all you want to do is hear more of this beautiful music. If you happen to be a sailor, then you generally will throw yourself overboard in order to get to the island where the sirens are so that you can experience this music to its fullest. Now, of course, throwing yourself overboard is not a great way to steer a ship. It's actually a very poor way to steer a ship. So the ship will usually end up crashing into the island, and then the sirens, I don't know, they eat people, I guess. Generally speaking, this is not a good thing if you're a sailor. So sailors have passed down this kind of oral history that music is terrible. In fact, music is very, very dangerous. If you hear music, get away from it as quickly as possible, because you're liable to throw yourself overboard and crash and be eaten. None of those are good things. Odysseus, however, is an amazing man. He is incredibly hubristic, and he is an egomaniac. And these qualities combine in him to form a person who, when he hears about the sirens, doesn't run away from them, doesn't want to run, but instead wants to be the only living person to have heard the song of the sirens and survived. It'd be a great story to tell his kids, I imagine. So how does he go about doing this? Well, he talks to a witch, and the witch has really excellent ideas. Some of those ideas are as follows. He talks to his men, all the men on the ship, and says, OK, bind me to the mast. Tie my hands behind my back, tie my legs to the mast, make it just absolutely impossible for me to do anything other than just be tied to a mast. Once he does this, his men are free to follow the other instructions he's given them, which are put beeswax in your ears and cover your heads in such a way that you can't actually hear anything that's going on around you. So they have kind of primitive earplugs going on. The men are then free to follow the rest of their instructions, which are basically row past this island, don't go to the island, please. Don't throw yourself overboard. That seems like a bad way to row. Just keep rowing, and if you see any sirens flying around, just kind of ignore them, keep your head down, and just keep rowing. They follow these instructions. They go past the island of the sirens. Odysseus is the only one on the ship who hears the siren song. It is absolutely beautiful. He's driven to the brink of madness, but he doesn't throw himself overboard. Not because he doesn't want to, of course, but because he has physically prevented himself from doing so by talking to his men, telling them to bind him to the mast in such a way that he can't actually get free to act on these things that he really, really wants to do. I think there are useful metaphors here for us. It would be good for us if our applications could tell the browser in some way that there are certain things that it is capable of doing, but shouldn't be allowed to do. So browsers, for instance, really love JavaScript. They just love it. When they see JavaScript, they want to execute it just as fast as they possibly can. Some JavaScript, however, is not so awesome, and you maybe don't want to execute that. It'd be really nice if we could, for instance, tell the browser that some JavaScript is good, some JavaScript is bad, and have the browser actually prevent the application from doing things that the application knows, in its moments of sanity, are going to cause harm. This generally boils down to the principle of least privilege. And I think the principle of least privilege is kind of bedrock for security, not just web security, but security in general. The idea of this principle is that each piece of an application, and each application in itself, should have only the minimum amount of privilege, only the minimum capability in order to do the action that it needs to do. So if you need to read from the database, that's great. This piece of the application should be able to read from the database. But if you have another piece of the application that just processes information, there's no reason to give that piece of the application equal access to the database. So give each piece of your application, first, split your application into pieces. We'll talk about that later. And second, give each piece only the least amount of privilege that it needs in order to do the specific job that that piece of the application needs to do. And you can get the browser to help you out with this so that it actually will lock down those pieces of the application so that they can't do certain things that you know are dangerous. The really nice thing about the web is that it is quite open. And the really nice thing about learning on the web is that everything on an origin has complete access to that origin. So all you have to do is put a web page somewhere on a domain, and you get complete access to all of the data on that domain, which is great. It makes it really easy to start building these applications quickly. It is, however, a bit problematic, and it would be nice if we could split things up. One of the things that's really actually quite dangerous about the web is that it allows you to send things over unencrypted connections. It would be really valuable, for a variety of reasons, if you could tell the user agent to only connect to your server over a secure connection. We'll talk about that in a moment. And this, I see, is kind of a prerequisite for anything else with regard to web security. If you're not sending information and receiving information over a secure channel, then you can leave right now and go do that, because that is the single most important thing that you can do in your applications. If you have a service and it has any sort of data, high-value data, medium-value data, low-value data, it's going to be attacked, and it's going to be attacked by people who have access to the network. Why does the network matter? Well, we conceive of the web something like this, where I have my laptop, and there's a server somewhere, and I make a request out to that server, the server gives me information back, and the world is right. We know, however, that we end up going to conferences and connecting to Wi-Fi networks. Do you trust the people that run the Wi-Fi network here at Devoxx? They look kind of shady, to be perfectly honest. We go to these conferences, and we go to coffee shops, and we go actually to our home. And we connect to the internet, not directly to each individual server, but instead always through intermediaries. We either have a local Wi-Fi network set up, or we're hopping and hopping and hopping from various proxies and various routers in the internet. And generally speaking, you have to trust each and every one of those endpoints in order to ensure that data is getting to the server in the exact same form that it was sent, and getting to you in the exact same form that the server sent. And that's absolutely impossible to do without some sort of encryption and without some sort of authentication. You do not get that over HTTP. It is simply impossible. If you're serving information over HTTP, you have absolutely zero guarantee that the information that's being sent and the information that's being received is accurate. And you also have zero guarantee that you're actually sending it to the person that you expect. If, however, you set up some sort of encryption, if you set up TLS, such that you have a cert on your server that authenticates that your server is, in fact, example.com, and uses that cert in order to set up an encrypted tunnel such that both sides communicate, not in plain text, but via a public key architecture that allows you to send information, have only the server be able to decrypt that information, and have the server send information to you that only you can decrypt. This gives you some modicum of guarantee that the information you send actually gets to the server accurately, and that the information the server sends back to you gets to you in a form that you can actually trust. Now, of course, this isn't perfect. It's never perfect. And we've seen over and over again in the last year or two that it is a system that is lacking in many ways. But TLS is the only system we have that is widely deployed enough to be of any value whatsoever. So I'd really highly recommend that you stop serving things over HTTP, period. If you have data, serve it over an encrypted channel. Some of the information that you have that you might or might not think is valuable are cookies. Cookies are, in fact, valuable because, generally speaking, that's how we maintain state. That's how we know that person A is, in fact, person A on your service and not person B or person C. Given that, it's very important to ensure that you only send cookies over a secure connection. And this is actually quite trivial. Add a secure flag when sending a set cookies header. This means that this cookie will only be sent over HTTPS and not over HTTP. It's absolutely trivial, but it actually has large impact on the security of your system, because it's pretty easy to trick people to accidentally go to HTTP as opposed to HTTPS. While you're there and while you're screwing with your cookies headers, add HTTP only as well. It's generally the case that you don't need to access cookies from JavaScript. This is one of those things that browsers allow you to do, but that you actually almost never need and will certainly be harmful. If there's a cross-site scripting attack on your site, the first thing the attacker is going to try to get are authentication cookies. HTTP only means that those cookies are not available via JavaScript. So document.cookie will throw an exception. It just won't contain this cookie, as opposed to containing the cookie and allowing the attacker to easily exfiltrate that information. This isn't perfect. There are certainly ways of getting cookies without JavaScript, but it makes the job of the attacker much harder. And raising that bar is really the entire goal of web security, so keep the bar high. Then, once you've done that, ensure that your users only connect to your site over HTTP. Don't give them, over HTTPS. Don't give them the option to connect over HTTP. You can do this by instructing the browser that your website should be protected by strict transport security. And this basically means that anytime I try to connect to example.com, HTTP example.com, there will be a transparent redirect locally before I actually touch the network. This means that even if I type into the browser HTTP example.com, because the browser has been instructed that example.com has STS enabled, it'll actually do that redirect for me locally. It'll never connect to the network over an insecure connection. And this is actually really quite valuable. It's a little bit dangerous because it means that if you screw up your certs, that people won't be able to access your site anymore. But generally, I think that's a risk that you should accept because this has such excellent security properties. It means that your users will never be subject to HTTP, which is just awesome. Now, as we all know, it's not perfect, right? And the clever among you will have noticed that in order to get this header, you probably had to connect over HTTP at least once, be redirected to HTTPS, and then get this header sent back down. And then the next connection, of course, is going to be perfectly secure. But that initial connection has a window of opportunity for smiley face people like this to intercept your connections and actually proxy SSL in between you and the server you're talking to. It's also the case that the weakest link in SSL or TLS is the certification agencies, or the certification authorities that are actually generating the certificates. We've seen time and time again that the weakest CA is going to generate a certificate for someone like Google, and then serve that certificate to people that probably shouldn't have it in the first place. Given that all TLS does is establish a trust connection between you and the CA, and the CA says that this server is google.com, it's quite possible for people to man in the middle of that and sit in between you and the server, make it look like you're connecting via SSL, and it's encrypted all the way to the man in the middle, and then encrypted all the way on the other side, but they've stepped in the middle with a bad certificate. It'd be nice if you could tell the browser that only certain certificates should be accepted for your domain. There's a good way to do this called public key pinning. Public key pinning is basically a mechanism by which you can say this certificate, and only this certificate, is valid for my domain. Not any certificate, not something authorized by anyone, but instead only this certificate signed with this public key. What you do here is take a hash of the public key that's used to generate the certificate. You can also take a hash of the CA if you want to say that you pin to the CA as opposed to pin to the specific certificate. But generally speaking, this allows you to say this certificate is valid, every other certificate is invalid. So if you see a certificate that doesn't match this pin, then don't accept it. And in fact, give the user a hard error that means they can't actually get to this page. Now, browsers have started hard-coding lists of both HSTS and public key pins hard-coded in the browser. So high-value sites like Google.com, Mail.google.com, PayPal, and a variety of others have asked the browser vendors to hard-code this information in the browser. And actually, if you have a site that you want to do this for, it's really quite trivial. You just file a bug, you can CC me, and I'll be happy to add you to the list. It's not a secret list. It's not something that only big companies can get onto. If you have an application that serves data that you think is valuable enough to pin the public key, we're happy to do that for you. It's really no big deal at all. The only danger here, again, is that if you screw up your SSL, then that means no one can connect to your site, period, actually, until we update the browser, which is a bit problematic. But again, for some forms of data, this risk is well worth it. So with that in mind, once we've talked about SSL, and once we've gotten that prerequisite out of the way, let's talk about some other things that the web allows that you might want the web not to allow for your particular application. One thing, of course, is framing. It is possible on any page, on example.com, for instance, to have an iframe that frames bank.com. And as long as bank.com is a website, it'll load in that iframe, and people will be able to interact with it. This is just a nice property of the web that you can actually compose things together. And we use it all the time for a variety of widgets that appear, whether they're like buttons or +1 buttons or comments if you're in terms of discuss or something along those lines. So we use this capability all over the place. It's actually quite valuable. But it might not be valuable for your website. So bank.com probably doesn't actually want to ever appear in a frame. And it would be a bit surprised if indeed it did appear in a frame. Facebook also has issues with this. So the main problem with this is something called clickjacking, or at least this is the most well-known problem with framing. And clickjacking works more or less like this. You, the user, go to a website, and on the website you see a big flashy button that says, hey, click me, this is going to be awesome. It entices you in some way to interact with a page. You click on the button, and something happens. It might not actually be what you expect, because what you don't see on this page is, of course, that there's a frame that's being guided under your mouse. And this frame contains some sort of information that the attacker wants you to click on. Now, because of the joys of the internet, every time a page is loaded via an iframe, you're actually sending all of your credentials to that page. So if you're logged into Facebook, and I pop up a like button in the page, then you're actually going to get that like button associated with your account. And if you click on the page, then you're going to like whatever it is that the attacker wants you to like. Now, liking isn't particularly valuable, although attackers, for whatever reason, are actually paid to do attacks like this, which I find absurd. But there are more valuable things that can be clickjacked. For instance, your bank account. If there are particular buttons that need to be clicked in order to transfer money from you to me, it's certainly possible to do that. Now, a good way of avoiding this is by telling the browser that your site should not be frameable. That if a person tries to load your site in a frame, that it should simply be blocked. You do this via an XFrame options header. The XFrame options header has two settings that are cross-browser and one more that I'll talk about in a moment. The two settings are deny or same origin, and they do more or less what you would expect. A site sent with an XFrame options deny header means that this site cannot be framed, and browsers will simply reject attempts to load that page within the context of either a frame or an iframe. Same origin means that the page has to be same origin with the top-level domain. So example.com, if it tries to frame bank.com, and bank.com sends same origin, that's going to fail. But if bank.com tries to frame bank.com, then that is, in fact, same origin. So the framing succeeds. This gives you a little bit of flexibility in terms of what you can do with the pages on your site. It might be possible, it might be good for you to frame certain pages on your site, but not so good to frame for other people to frame those pages. So same origin gives you a mechanism of doing that. There's one more attribute, or one more possibility for this header, called allow-from. That's supported in both Firefox and IE, and this is a whitelisting mechanism that says, well, I'll let example.com frame me, but I'm not going to let anyone else frame me. Something along these lines. WebKit and Blink both do not support this. We're actually both waiting for something that I'll talk about a little bit later on. And we actually would like people to use that as opposed to this, so not adding new features to this. We're going to keep it the way that it is for those two, but in Firefox and IE, if those are interesting to you, then allow from is certainly available. It's not, however, the case that this only protects you against clickjacking. There's a really excellent paper that came out about 3 days ago from a couple of folks that are really interesting security researchers, Mario and Freddie. I'd recommend, actually, that you take a look at this paper because it gives you some really interesting options for damaging things that can be done if you allow a page to be framed. Copy and paste might be possible. It might be possible to drag and drop things. It's certainly possible to set certain variables in the context of the page via like name attributes on the iframe. And then that can magnify the effect of cross-site scripting attacks that might be available in your pages. So generally speaking, if you don't have a distinct need for your site to be framed, send it an I header. There's no reason to allow things that you don't actually need. If you come up with a need in the future, you can drop the header for those specific pages on your site that need it. But generally speaking, lock your site down. Don't allow it to do things that it doesn't actually need to do, because those things might be damaging. The next sort of thing that might be problematic is MIME type sniffing. So some browsers will accept anything as a script. It doesn't matter what the MIME type of the script actually is. It could be application JavaScript, it could be text plain, it could be a GIF, it could be a variety of things. And this opens a wide variety of attacks, especially for sites that accept user-generated content. So if I can upload content to your site, and you serve it as a GIF, or you serve it as text, I might be able to trick a browser into actually loading that as script. And this can be problematic in a variety of ways. Instead of allowing the browser to determine for you whether or not something should be executable simply based upon whether it was included in a page or not, it would be valuable to set a content type options header of no sniff. And this basically says exactly what you would expect. Do not sniff. If the MIME type doesn't match a set of MIME types that should be executable, then don't execute it. If it doesn't match a set of MIME types that should be viewed as CSS, then don't render it as CSS. This was especially problematic, and it was actually introduced back in IE7 or IE8. I don't actually remember. They had there were actually significant problems where you could load a file as CSS just via a normal link tag. And then using the CSS object model, you could actually read data from that file, assuming it had certain characters in it in a certain order. This was really actually quite problematic because it allowed cross-origin leakage of data. This was introduced in order to combat that specific problem. But it's also quite useful, not only in IE, but also in Firefox and WebKit/Blink, because we're using it there just for scripts. I don't think we're doing anything else. We actually block CSS that isn't CSS by default, so you don't actually have to do anything there. The browser does it for you. But for script, if you send the no sniff header along with the page, then we'll only execute script if it comes with a certain MIME type. And actually, this is quite valuable. So again, don't allow the browser to just execute anything just because it kind of looks like script, and the browser really likes JavaScript. Instead, make sure the browser takes a close look at what it is that it's about to execute before it dives right in and starts parsing and executing just as fast as it possibly can. So this is the list of acceptable JavaScript types in Blink. This is actually in Chromium. You'll see that it's kind of a mix of lists from IE and Firefox and WebKit. We're trying to have some sort of compatibility, but there are certainly things that IE will execute that we will not. So, but generally speaking, the things that you would expect to be JavaScript are in fact JavaScript, and they're accepted cross-origin, across browser. So generally just send JavaScript with application JavaScript, and you'll be more or less good to go. So we talked a little bit earlier about cross-site scripting. And cross-site scripting is one type of attack that's broadly categorized as content injection. Content injection attacks are when an attacker is able to inject content onto your page. Shockingly, right? It's an amazing feat of naming. Generally speaking, this is quite possible on sites. It's difficult to avoid the fact that users who are able to interact with your site in some way will upload content of one sort or another and be able to influence the things that are displayed on a page. Now, you should be doing a lot of escaping. You should be ensuring that both the input that you receive and the things that you put onto the page are escaped correctly for the contexts in which they find themselves, which we'll talk about in a moment. But generally speaking, it's a difficult problem, and it's probably, regardless of the ordering of the OWASP list, I would say content injection is the most important thing from a client-side security perspective that we can actually start mitigating with some of these tactics. content injection is problematic, especially script injection, because of the concept of an origin. Now, an origin is a scheme, a host, and a port. So HTTP example.com 80, or HTTPS google.com 443. As I said earlier, all the script that executes in the context of an origin has access to everything in that origin. All the local storage, all the cookies, if you haven't set the HTTP-only header, all the HTML5 storage mechanisms like WebSQL or IndexedDB or file systems. Any data that you have on that origin is accessible to that script. Moreover, any data you have that's accessible via REST APIs on that origin is accessible via XML HTTP request from script. So generally speaking, any script that executes in the context of your origin has access to all of your data. That's generally not what you want an attacker to have access to. You want to limit that to whatever extent possible. What's the difference between these two scripts? Exactly, there's no difference between these two scripts as far as the browser is concerned. Now, visually, we can inspect these scripts, and we can say, well, the first one, that's awesome. I want to do that like 8 times. The second one, however, I have no idea how that got on my page. I didn't write be evil. I didn't write this code. This is crazy. Now, this, of course, could come in if you don't escape output correctly. If you allow users to have any name they want, and they call themselves open script tag, be evil, close script tag, and you don't escape that correctly, then that's actually going to execute on your page when you say hello person. That's problematic. And it's something that we can actually, that the browser can't do anything about, because there's no difference between these two scripts. Again, the browser loves JavaScript. Every time it sees JavaScript, it's going to grab it, execute it as quickly as it possibly can, and then get back to you. There are several contexts in which information can find itself on your page. And unfortunately, due to the vagaries of the HTML specification, the escaping rules for all of these contexts are different. So for example, if you have a comment and you put some debug info into a comment, if the debug info contains 2 dashes, that'll actually close the comment and everything else will be rendered. Inside of a p tag, on the other hand, 2 dashes would just render 2 dashes and continue. So the rules are different. And because of that, you need to be very sure that you're escaping content correctly for the explicit context in which it finds itself. So if you're writing out debug data into a comment, you need to escape double dashes. If you're doing something in a p tag, then you need to escape a variety of things, actually. HTML tags, certainly, but also entities and a variety of other things. So while on the one hand, it is a trivial problem, it is absolutely trivial. The rules are just in the specification. All you have to do is do it correctly. It is, unfortunately, the fact that we're really, really bad at trivial problems. If we look at the history of the web, this is probably the single biggest mistake that we've made over and over again, everywhere. Google makes this mistake. Everyone makes this mistake. Alex Russell puts this brilliantly and beautifully when he says, I discount the probability of perfection. It's difficult to be perfect. And because of that difficulty, even if the problem is trivial, we're going to make single small mistakes. And those single small mistakes, if they allow someone to inject script into your page, is really all that it takes. Because one mistake allows someone complete access to your origin. I would rephrase this a little bit. I would say that we are all idiots with deadlines. We're bad at trivial problems, and we generally have other things we'd rather be doing. And we generally have someone standing over us saying, hey, why didn't you do this other thing already? We aren't, generally speaking, paid to consider security. It's kind of assumed that we're looking at doing things securely, but really what we're focusing on this quarter and next quarter is building this great new feature. And we need to ensure that when we do that, we're keeping in the back of our minds all these security rules and all these things that can be really problematic if we don't do them correctly. So one thing that the browser can do for you is actually start looking for the trivial sorts of reflected cross-site scripting attacks that we see all the time. So if there's a get parameter that contains a name, or a post parameter that contains a name, and that name is directly reflected into the DOM, the browser can actually start helping you out with that. It can look at the get parameter and say, hey, this thing appears directly in the page. I'm going to block that from executing for you, because that's probably not what you intended. I would recommend, however, that that's the default behavior. In WebKit, Blink, Firefox also hasn't a XSS protection, and I'm certain that IE does as well. What attackers discovered, however, quite quickly, is that the browser can't distinguish between maliciously injected script and script that looks like it could be maliciously injected. So what attackers would start doing is actually finding pieces of script on the page that they didn't want to execute, and then they would put that in the get parameter. So they weren't actually injecting script. They were actually blocking script from your page from running simply by putting it into the get parameters, because the browser would see, oh, this must be a reflection, would stop the script from executing, and that could actually put your site into a more vulnerable state than it was to begin with. So XSS protection backfired a little bit. I would highly recommend that you not just turn it on, but instead that you turn it on in blocking mode, which basically means that instead of not executing a specific piece of script, that if the browser detects trivial reflection, it should block the entire page from rendering. This is how Facebook sets it up, and this is how I would recommend that you set it up if you want to use the built-in XSS protection in the browser. And I'd kind of recommend that you do that, because it is, in fact, valuable. If, on the other hand, you decide that the risk is too great and you want complete control over the things that are going on in your site, and you're very confident in the fact that you don't have these sorts of reflected script problems, then you can turn off the browser's XSS protection by setting XSS protection of 0. It's kind of a toss-up for me as to whether I'd recommend the first or the second. I would recommend the first, but I think there are good reasons for turning this off entirely, because sometimes, depending on how your site's structured, it can just be buggy. What's nice about this, and what's kind of undocumented, is that in Blink, and WebKit too, there is a report functionality associated with this, so that you can actually, when the page is blocked, have a post go out to an endpoint on your server. And that post will contain the URL of the page that was blocked, and a little bit of information about the request, so that you can try to figure out what actually happened and whether there are holes in your site that allowed this sort of trivial reflection to occur. So if you get a URL that has a really long query string that seems to be doing something relatively strange, that can point you to a place in your code that you might want to take a closer look at. So the reporting functionality here is actually quite important. None of this is standard, so all of these X headers are kind of just things that browsers have done because they thought they were good at the time. Generally speaking, each browser is going to have a slightly different implementation, and the implementation of XSS protection is certainly quite different from browser to browser. But I know that this works in Blink, and I think it made it into WebKit before Blink appeared on the scene. The next thing is the most important thing I'm going to talk about today. If you remember nothing else from this entire talk, just write this URL down. You don't have to look at it right now. You probably can't, given the Wi-Fi. But generally speaking, this is something that I would really highly recommend that you read. It's talking about content security policy. And it's going to give you all of the detail that you need in order to start implementing content security policy on your pages and on your applications. What is content security policy? Has anyone heard of content security policy? OK. That's not that many of you. Hopefully, after this talk, you can tell all of your friends. I think it's incredibly important. So, content security policy. Content security policy is a whitelisting mechanism that allows you to, with a lot of granularity, determine what resources can load on your page and what resources should not be loaded on your page. Again, we talked about this earlier problem that the browser, anytime it sees a resource, will simply load that resource and embed it in your page. That's what the browser is there for. That's its job, and that's what it really wants to be doing. Your application, however, wants to lock that down a little bit. You want to load only those resources that are actually part of your application. And you don't want to load any resources that are coming from third parties or that are coming from outside the context of your application. So if you start loading things from evil.com, you probably know that you don't want to be doing that, but the browser has no idea. Content security policy gives you a mechanism by which you can explain to the browser what resources are part of your application and what resources it should simply stop loading entirely. You send this as an HTTP header, content-security-policy, and it's a semicolon delimited list of directives, each directive controlling a specific type of resource. So here is the content security policy for an incredibly high-value website, mikewest.org. You may have heard of it. It's really amazing. You should go to it, all of you. I start by locking down everything, so a default source of none, which basically means no external resource should load at all. And then I slowly open the door, so I slowly start whitelisting things and saying, well, no resources except for style for my CDN. And I want to have some YouTube and some speaker deck frames. I also want some script for my CDN and also from Google Analytics. I want images, and I want styles, and I want a variety of other things. By starting with a default source of none, and then slowly opening the doors to those specific origins for script, or those specific origins for resources, you can fairly granularly control the things that can be loaded on your pages. And you can ensure that even if someone can inject script into your page, they won't be able to load those resources, and they won't be able to connect out to their servers in order to exfiltrate that information. This is really quite valuable in terms of mitigating the effects of cross-site scripting. It's not going to stop people from injecting things in your page. Only good escaping can do that. So you really need to focus on the server side. You need to make sure that you're escaping things correctly. But given the fact that you're going to screw up, that I'm going to screw up, that we're all going to screw up together in a beautiful way, it's generally quite valuable to mitigate that risk by ensuring that only those specific types of resources can be loaded on your page that you've whitelisted with a content security policy. This is an exhaustive list of everything that's in Content Security Policy 1.0, which is currently implemented in Chrome in new versions of Safari, so Safari 6.1 and Safari 7 on both iOS and on desktop. It's in Firefox 23+. There's a single directive implemented in IE. I'm hoping they step up their game at some point. Maybe IE 12, who knows? It's only going to be another year. Generally speaking, content security policy allows you to control specific types of resources. So most of these are quite self-explanatory. Image source controls images. Media source controls video and audio tags, as well as track elements. Frame source controls frames and iframes, and so on. Connect source is interesting. That will control to the origins to which you can connect via XML HTTP request, and also things like event source and WebSockets. Sandbox we'll talk about a little bit later on. And the last thing here is report URI. So report URI here is basically the same thing that I talked about a moment ago with XSS protection. The report URI gives you a mechanism by which you can start detecting the attacks that are occurring on your pages. You'll get a post to this endpoint that contains a variety of pieces of information that will make it easier for you to figure out that A, you are being attacked, and B, what exactly the attack looks like and where you need to start looking in your code in order to fix that. If it comes from script, we'll give you a line number, a column number, and we'll give you the kinds of information that you'll need. What you'll also notice here is that the header has changed. It's Content Security Policy report only. So there are actually two headers that you can send. One is a report-only header, and one is an enforce header, right? So the enforce header actually blocks things on your page if they don't pass through the policy. The report-only header, on the other hand, will allow all the resources to load, but will send you these posts in order to allow you to first roll out a relatively weak policy that says something like HTTPS only. You can roll that out in enforce mode because you know that all the content on your page is HTTPS. In report-only mode, however, you can have a much stricter policy that you think applies to all the pages on your site. You'll rapidly find that you've missed a couple of pages and that, in fact, you need to change the policy in some way or change your application in some way. Once you've stopped getting reports from the report-only policy, you can move that into enforce mode, and then you have a nicely locked-down policy that you know that you've tested and that you know isn't actually going to break your application. So a report-only policy gives you a nice way of rolling this out onto a site without actually enforcing it in a way that might not work immediately. So it gives you a good way of testing in both your production environments and in your test environments. Now, the biggest problem on the web is inline script. So with regard to the things that we talked about earlier, if someone is able to inject script into your page, the reason it's dangerous is because the browser can't distinguish between good script on your page and bad script on your page. All it sees is script. Given that, Content Security Policy 1.0 has basically thrown the baby out with the bathwater. We know that there are good uses of inline script. So a lot of people use it in order to reduce the latency of the first hit, for instance. And those are really valuable performance benefits associated with the inline script. But because it's so problematic, and because we wanted to get something out the door that was valuable immediately, we've thrown out inline script entirely. So if you're using a content security policy, by default, inline script will be blocked. You can turn on inline script by setting the unsafe inline origin. We call it unsafe inline because it's kind of unsafe, and we kind of don't want you to use it if at all possible. But if you really need it, at the moment, you can turn that on. We'd like you, however, to leave it off, which means that you'll need to take script that looks like this. So if you have script contained within a script tag, if you have inline JavaScript, or inline event handlers or a JavaScript URL, you'll need to externalize those into separate files. So you'll need to load a file. Loading the file is important because the browser can easily identify the origin from which that file comes. And that's kind of the entire concept behind the content security policy, that because I can identify the origin, I can determine whether that origin is good or not. You'll externalize that information, and then you'll do some DOM manipulation in order to associate event handlers with the things that you were doing with inline scripts before. This is really straightforward, and honestly, it's kind of what you've been taught to be doing anyway, right? You want to separate your concerns. You want to have HTML that controls just the markup and actually is semantic and gives you some good value with regard to the data that's on your page. You have JavaScript that controls behavior, and you have CSS that controls layout and presentation. You want to separate those to whatever extent possible. Mixing them just makes your job more difficult. That said, because we understand that we've thrown out some babies, and we kind of want to start looking in the water and seeing how many babies we can save, because babies are kind of nice and they don't swim very well, we really want to make sure that we have mechanisms in Content Security Policy 1.1 in order to enable this sort of distinguishing between good script and bad script. And we think we have two mechanisms that are valuable in order to make these distinctions. The first is a nonce. So a cryptographic nonce is a number used once. And the idea is this. In the header, you send a random string, and the string can be whatever length you think is appropriate. SHA-256 is probably a good way to do it. Those 32 bytes are then repeated in a nonce attribute in every script on the page that you actually want to be there. So when you render the page, you deliver a secret, and you repeat that secret in each of the script blocks. Assuming that secret is unguessable, which if it's just random, it should be, attackers won't be able to inject script that contains the secret, meaning that their script won't execute, your script will execute. That's the general idea behind this. It's quite straightforward, and this is implemented currently in Chrome behind a flag. It's in CSP 1.1, and we expect that to be moved. That's currently an working draft. We expect that to be moving to CR, probably go to last call sometime later this year. The second idea is a hash. So if you know beforehand what script is going to execute on your page, you can send the hash of that script as part of the content security policy. Scripts on the page that match this hash. So here we're saying the SHA-256 of this code is X. Assuming that the script matches X once we hash it, then we'll execute it. If it doesn't match, then we won't execute it. This is actually quite safe, assuming you're using SHA-256. We're not going to support MD5. SHA-1 is kind of on the border, but SHA-256 is a good hash function that we think has good uniqueness properties for the foreseeable future. So I think we're pretty happy supporting that. That's also implemented in Chrome, kind of again, experimental. It's behind the experimental web platform features flag. So if you'd like to play around with it now and give us some feedback on it, we'd certainly quite appreciate it. So let me go back to the slide because I think it's important, and I want to give the URL one more time. Again, if you remember nothing else from this talk, remember this page. I really do think that it's one of the most important things to happen in client-side security in the last couple of years. I'm a bit biased. I edit the spec along with Adam Barth from Google and Dan Vedetz from Mozilla, who are much smarter than I am. They tell me what to type, and I type it. It's great. It's a good relationship. But generally speaking, I think it's really important. And if you have an application that has any sort of data associated with it whatsoever, that has any sort of users associated with it, do yourself and do your users a favor. Start playing around with content security policy. It has really, really good properties with regard to blocking content injection and mitigating the effects of cross-site scripting, which I think is really quite valuable. So with that in mind, the next thing that you can ask the browser to not do is to actually reduce the capability of iframes. So if you have an iframe on a page, that iframe executes just like any other web page. It has access to script. It comes from an origin, so it's getting cookies and getting a variety of other things. Generally speaking, that's fine. But if you're loading third-party content into your web page, it can be quite valuable, and actually first-party content as well, it can be quite valuable to ratchet down the level of permission that this iframe actually has, so that it can't, for instance, load plugins, or can't, for instance, load script. You can do this via the Sandbox attribute on an iframe. The Sandbox attribute does what it says on the tin. It puts the iframe into a sandbox and reduces its privilege in a number of ways. Foremost, it puts it into a unique origin. I'll talk about what that means exactly in a moment. The technical definition is simply that it's an origin that does not match any other origin, regardless of where the page actually comes from. Plugins won't run. It won't run script. You can't submit forms. You can't navigate the top level, so you can't do window.top location. You can't pop up. You can't autoplay video or autoplay audio. There's no pointer lock, and there are no seamless iframes. So it gives you a frame that doesn't do much. It can render some content, and that's about it. This can actually be quite valuable if, for instance, you have comments on a page. Generally speaking, you don't want user comments to have plugins. You don't want user comments to be able to navigate or execute script or anything along these lines. Given that, putting a user comment into a sandboxed iframe can be a valuable way of taking this piece of your application that doesn't need any privilege and putting it into an environment that has no privilege, so it can't actually execute bad things, even if the user is able to bypass all of your escaping mechanisms. You can, of course, ratchet these back up, so Sandbox by itself will have all of the restrictions that we just talked about. There are a variety of allow attributes that you can put into the list of Sandbox attributes in order to start turning these features back on. So if you want to allow form submission, then allow forms would be valuable. If you want to allow pop-ups would be valuable. Most of these are pretty self-explanatory, so I won't go through all of them in detail. Note, however, that you can't turn on plugins in a sandboxed iframe. The reason for this is that plugins are inherently unsandboxed. They generally, in every browser other than Chrome, there is no mechanism by which a plugin can execute in a sandboxed environment. NP API is simply raw access to the computer. PP API, the Pepper APIs, are better. They are sandboxed. So the Flash that executes within Chrome is a sandboxed API. And it's in theory, we could start turning these on in sandbox iframes at some point in the future. But generally speaking, we're sticking with the no plugins because plugins kind of suck and we don't like them. There's a good article written by a very handsome man on HTML5 Rocks that tells you about sandboxed iframes and tells you a lot of detail about the individual things that each of these attributes will do, and shows you how, for instance, you can take some third-party widgets that you want to include, like Twitter, and reduce them to the minimum level of privilege that widget actually needs in order to run on your page. And this has some really good properties. What's interesting about this is that it opens the door for messaging between pieces of your application. So I've titled this cross-origin communication, but it's really not just cross-origin. It's cross-origin in the sense that a particular piece of your application can be pushed into a separate origin via a sandbox. But generally speaking, it's still loading from your origin. So if you have a frame on your page, and you've sandboxed that frame, so let's assume for the moment that you have some sort of computation that needs to happen. You have a piece of your application that talks to the database, and another piece of your application that processes that information from the database in some way and gives you some HTML back. So perhaps it's a templating library. You can actually put that templating library into a separate iframe, sandbox the iframe so that it can run script, but it can do nothing else, and it doesn't have access to anything in your origin. Then you read information from the database, and you push it into this frame via post message. So you give it all the information that it needs in order to do some processing, and you await a response. When you get a response back, you verify that the origin is correct, and then you do something useful with it. So if you're doing cross-origin messaging, you can use post message in order to talk to separate windows. So you can open a window to example.com and start sending it messages, and you can get information back from that separate origin. This gives you a nice way of communicating between disparate services. But if you've sandboxed your iframe, it actually doesn't have an origin at all. So the tests need to look a little bit different. First, you need to send to star because there's no origin associated with this page, and there's no way of specifying this unique origin. It is simply unique and matches nothing. So you need to send potentially to anything. When you get it back, you need to check that the origin is null, meaning that it is in fact a sandbox iframe that's sending you this message and not example.com or some third-party attacker. And secondly, you need to verify that the message is coming from the frame that you expect it to come from. There are subtle vulnerabilities that can be opened up when you start listening for messages. You need to be very, very sure that you're listening for messages in a way that actually validates that the messages are what you expect and not coming from malicious third parties. Within the context of the frame, you want to verify that the origin of the message is that what you expect. So if it's coming from the same server, then you look for the page's location. You grab the origin of the location, not of the page. That is, if the page comes from example.com/frame.html, then its location's origin is example.com. The page's origin, the window.origin, is going to be something different entirely. You verify, so in this case, you verify that the message is coming from the same origin as your location, and then you do something and post a message back. Now, the danger here is that there's a lot of validation that needs to happen. You need to verify that the origins that are giving you messages and the origins to which you're sending messages are, in fact, those that you expect. There are some interesting things coming up called message channels, MessagePorts, that make this problem a little bit easier to deal with. So a message channel when you create it, spawns 2 ports. And it entangles those ports together such that a message pushed into one port appears on the other port, and vice versa. But there's no magical cross-origin issues, because you're not listening on the window, you're listening only on these ports. And you can pass these ports around as simple capability tokens, more or less. So you can say, anyone who holds this port can get this information. And then you give the port to the specific piece of your application that actually needs it. You can actually use this within the context of your application. It doesn't need to be cross-origin at all. You can say that the database piece of my application gets one side of the port, and the templating section of my application gets the other side of the port. And that allows them to communicate together, even though they don't have, and they shouldn't have, direct access to each other's data. Message channels have been around in WebKit and in Chrome for quite some time. They've just landed in Firefox behind a flag. There's one more thing that Firefox needs to do with regard to shared workers in order to make that available to the web at large, but that should be happening relatively soon because they need it for Firefox OS. So the expectation is that this is going to be available in many browsers relatively soon, and it's something that I think is going to be really useful for generating capability systems within the context of your application. You can say, this port means you have access to this data, and then only give that port to the specific piece of your application that needs it. Now, one of the things I said I was going to talk about in the description of this talk was the Web Crypto API. Unfortunately, there was a great talk yesterday by Nick that I think is well worth anyone's time who's interested at all in cryptography on the web. He's already posted it online, so I think it's really quite worth your time to take a look at this presentation. It walks through in great detail the things that are possible within the Web Crypto API, so generating digests, encrypting things, generating keys, importing keys. It also shows a couple of polyfills that exist, so that even in browsers that don't yet support it, which is like Chrome has it behind a flag, Firefox has it in stable, I believe, IE certainly has it in stable, or at least pieces of it in stable. So it's something that you can start experimenting now if you have a need for either generating digests, generating keys, doing key exchange between pieces of your application or between multiple applications, and encrypting and decrypting messages. The Web Crypto API is really quite powerful. It's a little bit complicated. It's more than a little bit complicated, actually. It's quite a low-level API. But this presentation, I think, does a pretty good job walking through the use cases and walking through a lot of detail about each individual piece. So I actually dropped all the Web Crypto stuff from this talk last night at about 3 in the morning when I decided that I didn't want to repeat information that was presented so well yesterday. So I'd really recommend that when you get a chance, you take a look at this presentation. It's going to give you a lot of detail about the Web Crypto API, which I think is really quite interesting indeed. And with that, I thank you for your time. The question was, how do you make sure your application is only allowed to run in a secure browser? Generally speaking, everything I've talked about are extra layers of security that you can put on top of your application, on top of the solid core of your application that you need to build. None of this removes the necessity for you to do proper escaping of both input and output. So that's necessary. But knowing that you're going to screw it up, knowing that everyone screws it up, we want to provide mechanisms to mitigate the impact of screwing it up. So in browsers that support, for example, content security policy, you'll see attacks because you're getting reports. And those reports will enable you to fix bugs. Fixing those bugs will protect all of your users. So you can look at this kind of like an inoculation. So you get an inoculation against the flu. That protects you and allows you to protect other people by not getting the flu yourself and not spreading it. So generally speaking, none of this has value for browsers that don't support it. But you probably need to support those browsers, which means, again, it's really important to do the server side correctly. Anyone else? Yeah? Does all the advice also apply for mobile apps? And yes, of course. So everything that's supported in Chrome is also supported in Chrome on Android. Everything that's supported in Safari is also supported in Safari on iOS. And generally speaking, the new stuff that's coming up, because those browsers are starting to increment on their own and auto-update when you update the OS, you're getting a lot of these kind of new protections in the browsers on the mobile platforms that you know and love. So content security policy is absolutely something you should be looking at not only on desktop but also on mobile. And the other ones will apply as well. Yeah. Great. If anyone else has any questions, I'll be around afterwards. Thank you very much for your time.